You're listening to the Elevate Podcast, and I'm your host, Robert Glazer. Join me as I talk to world-class performers about how they build their capacity and reach greater heights in leadership, business, and life, and how you can do the same. Charles, welcome to the Elevate Podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, I'm excited to have you here. I keep like 20 of the most impactful books I read on my desk, and your yellow and red copy of the Power of Habit is right in the middle. So a little bit of a
thank you.
Full circle moment here.
Yeah, thanks so much. That's really nice of you to say.
So I'm always interested with the beginning. Like if you think about your childhood, like what were you passionate about? What were some of the experiences that you think might have led you down the path that you eventually ended on?
Well, I grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico,
Okay.
and I have 9 siblings. And
What number are you?
I'm third from the bottom. There's 2 more after
9.
me. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
And when I was in high school, I was so into debate. I mean, like debate was my entire life. I basically spent all of my time getting ready for debate tournaments, going to debate tournaments, caring about debate tournaments. And so that was a really profound experience, because one of the things that it taught me how to work hard, right? And how to persevere. And then I went to college, and after college, I started a company in Albuquerque where I'd grown up. And I realized pretty quickly that I didn't know what I was doing. So I applied to business school, and halfway through my first year of business school, we sold the company. And so as a result, suddenly I was in business school, and I was like, I don't know what to do with the rest of my life. Like,
and what was the business?
We built medical education campuses for universities. It's a super weird thing. I started it with my father.
Specific. Yeah. Okay.
It was very, very specific, very, very odd, and it worked really, really well.
So that business school paid off. Yeah.
Well, except that halfway through it, I suddenly didn't have a job anymore. And I realized I had all this freedom, and I was trying to figure out kind of what to do with that. And one of the things, between first and second year of business school, you get an internship.
Yeah.
And it's usually at a place where you hope you're going to get hired. And so I got an internship in private equity, real estate private equity, in New Mexico. And I was trying to decide basically, like, should I move back to New Mexico and go into politics and, run for office? And I would walk into the job every day, and I'd sit down and I'd make spreadsheets all day long. And the best part of my day is that sometimes I would let myself listen to a This American Life episode on my computer. And sometimes if it was a really hard day, I'd let myself listen to 2, but never more than 2, because I didn't want to run out of them.
Yeah.
And at the end of the summer, I kind of thought to myself, if the best part of each day was listening to This American Life, I probably should go try and make This American Life stories, right? I should probably listen to that. And so I decided to become a journalist. And I spent the second year of business school essentially figuring out how to be a journalist. And I've never looked back. It's been great since then.
So what was your big break or your big story in journalism?
Well, I mean, I don't know that there's like one big break. I wrote a series about Apple that won the Pulitzer.
Yeah.
So that was great. But the truth of the matter is that, like, the thing about journalism is its shelf life is like 2 or 3 days tops, right? Like nobody goes back and they're like, I really want to read that newspaper story.
Maybe 5 years ago, maybe down to minutes or hours. Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I write now for the New Yorker in addition to books. And the New Yorker is, I think, a little bit different. I think magazine journalism still can be something that people read for a little bit longer. But I would say the big break for me was getting hired by the New York Times and really learning and focusing on becoming an investigative reporter. Because being an investigative reporter is different from being the other kinds of reporters, in that you work for months and months and months before something comes out. And so much of newspaper is fast twitch that you really have to figure out how to get okay with that.
I just had another guest on who started as an investigative reporter. We were having this discussion. I won't try to bias you, but like, it seems like, is it hard to be an investigative reporter today within this sort of, it seems like most publications know, or a lot of people are implementing like the outcome that they are looking for before their investigation, which to me was always the opposite of the point of investigative. But there's just so much politics tainting journalism today.
I would not say that's true.
Okay.
I mean, I think that if you look at like the investigative series that have been done, I don't think, if you look at the Times or the Journal or the Washington Post, I mean, if by
the Post, I can't give, they've been particularly hard to stomach these days.
Well, but I think the question you're asking isn't, the reporter have a predisposition before they go in? Because you can't make up the facts, right? You go in and you try and find out.
Correct. You can't make up the facts, but you can make facts support a narrative if you wanted to, right?
I mean, it's pretty hard if you're. I mean, to be honest with you, because you're going to get attacked relentlessly if you do. So let's take, for instance, like the New York Times investigation of Trump's taxes, right?
Yeah.
I think, some people might say like, oh, well, they're going after President Trump and they're sort of going in assuming that like they're going to find something involving his taxes. The truth of the matter is that, every president had released their tax returns except for Trump.
Yeah.
And so it's very natural, whether he's a Democrat or a Republican, whether you like him or dislike him, it's very natural to say like, why won't this guy release his tax returns? Like, what's going on there? Yeah. And then when you find, lo and behold, that he has basically not paid taxes in, a decade, and not illegally, but because he's using loopholes in the IRS code, I don't think that that's coming at things with an agenda as much as recognizing that like the people in power deserve scrutiny. And when we scrutinize not for all the things that they're doing really, really well, but we're scrutinizing for the things that we ought to be worried about that they don't want us to know about.
No, that's fair. And look, as you said, you spent a lot of time looking at Apple and its role, transformation of the role in the economy. I'm curious, like, what did you discover in that reporting, kind of looking back, that was particularly prescient and that's actually continued to this day, even under a different regime? Yeah,
we're still dealing with it. I mean, the basic finding for the Apple series is the reason Apple is producing overseas is not because it is cheaper labor. It's because China in particular has labor that the United States does not have. And they have supply chains that we do not have. If you just look at mid-level engineers, the United States produces many wonderful top-level engineers, right? That's why Silicon Valley exists. That's why
we just don't have the volume in the middle.
Yeah, we just don't have volume in the middle. So like when it comes to someone who like needs enough engineering to run a production line, but doesn't need a PhD, we have many fewer people like that. And that actually impacts our ability to do manufacturing.
Well, there's a big push to, bring chip making and a lot of things back. Like, do you think we'll be successful at that? Or do you think it requires retraining a whole group of people?
Yeah, I think we will be successful because I think in part, there's two things happening. I think that like sort of commodity level engineering has become so commonplace that it's no longer a competitive advantage for a particular nation state. But I think the second thing that's happening is that with sufficient support, you see education programs and people move into jobs that they weren't considering otherwise. Singapore is a great example of this, right? Or Taiwan, where basically if you create the demand for jobs, then the supply will begin to equalize it.
Funny how that happens.
Yeah. The issue for the United States historically has been that we weren't creating demand for mid-level engineering jobs. And so if you went and you got a master's in mechanical engineering and you weren't a great coder, there was just no point to getting the master's, right? You either get a PhD or you get an undergraduate degree.
And I guess if we open all of these huge facilities under the CHIP Act, like they're going to need people, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That's I think the theory is that there's a certain amount of like onshoring of skills that the United States needs to be safe going forward. And the way that we do that is we create the demand for those jobs.
So you were focused on Apple. The book that really launched your kind of career as a household name was The Power of Habit, which I spoke about. One of the more widely read books, I think, in America. Like, what led you to that? Were you doing something else, or did you just develop sort of an interest in that area?
Well, a couple of things. And in my most recent book, Supercommunicators, that came out earlier this year, it's very similar in this respect, which is I kind of got to this place where, I was doing well at the New York Times. I was a very successful journalist. And I thought to myself, like, if I'm so smart, like, why do I have so much trouble getting up and going running in the morning, right? Why do I have so much trouble getting myself to eat a salad instead of like an unhealthy sandwich? And so I just got really curious and trying to understand, like, what do we know about habit formation? And so I started reaching out to researchers, and they said, basically, like, we're living through this golden age of understanding how habits function in our brain. And that's where the book came from. I wanted to solve my own problem. The same thing is true of Supercommunicators.
That's usually where good business comes from. So
yeah, no, that's exactly right. And with Supercommunicators, the same thing. I'm a professional communicator. I couldn't figure out why I kept having communication problems with my wife and with my coworkers and the people who matter to me. And so I called neurologists, neuroscientists, and I asked them, and they said, we're glad you called, because it turns out we're living through a golden age of understanding communication, right? We understand what's happening inside people's brains for the first time when they talk to each other. And so I think when you find something like that, it feels like a real opportunity to share that knowledge, which is a relatively new knowledge, with the world.
Well, we'll get to Supercommunicator, but I just want to get to two principles from Power Habit. I know because some people may not. Can you talk a little bit about the three fundamentals of habit formation, cue, routine, and reward, for those who have never really formally understood that?
Sure. Yeah, we tend to think of a habit as being one thing, right? Like I brush my teeth, or I go for a run in the morning.
Yeah.
But actually, every single habit in our life, and about 40 to 45% of what we do every day is a habit, every single habit in our life has three components. There is a cue, which is like a trigger for this automatic behavior to start. And then the routine, which is the behavior itself. Yeah. And then finally, a reward. Every habit you have has a reward. When you brush your teeth, there's a reward. When you back your car out of the driveway without
the reward might be not getting cavities, right? Sometimes
it's actually not. That's not an effective reward. Yeah. So what happens, the reason why we brush our teeth is because they add some oils to the toothpaste that make our gums tingle. And we've come to associate that tingling sensation with clean teeth. And so, for instance, if I take a shower and I don't brush my teeth, I don't really feel clean because I'm missing that tingling. So that's the idea, is that if you want to create habits, or if you want to change habits, you really have to identify the cues and the rewards in order to figure out what the gears are that you can fiddle with.
Got it. And so which is more, I guess you need to change all of them, right? The cue, you got to identify the cue and then figure out how to rewire the reward. Is that sort of...
No, it's actually, so this is known as the golden rule of habit change. What you need to do is you take an established habit, right?
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about creating a new habit. You would choose, if you want to go running in the morning, say, or go exercise with your friends. So the first thing you do is choose a cue. Like put your running shoes next to your bed so you see them right when you wake up. Lay out your running clothes so you jump into them as soon as you wake up. Then go for that run, right? Maybe 2 blocks, half a mile, whatever it is. When you get home, give yourself a reward. Give yourself a reward, like a light, or a nice long shower, or a smoothie, something that just makes it feel rewarding.
Yeah.
And then what your brain will do, it'll start to associate that cue, that routine, and that reward in sort of a thicker neural pathway. And as a result, an electrical charge can move down that pathway more effortlessly than previously. Now,
does it work the same for good habits versus bad habits?
Well, there's no such thing as a good habit or a bad habit.
Or a habit that you want to do more of versus a habit that you want to do less of, I guess.
Yeah. So I think that, if it's a habit that you wish to discourage, then if it has a really strong reward, it's going to be harder. Right. And if you say okay, I'm going to go running in the morning and my reward is going to be a kale smoothie, that's a terrible reward. Nobody actually likes kale smoothies, right? If you put enough peanut butter and dates in it, maybe it tastes okay, but you have to give yourself a reward that you actually enjoy.
Yeah, I had Professor Katie Milkman on, and one of the things she was saying was the thing that seems to work the most from a negative incentive these days, like if you want to lose weight or otherwise, is something you set up where you donate $100 to your political adversary, like the person, that it is, that it's incredibly powerful to commit to something that it's interesting, because she said obviously that's not a positive reward, but I guess it was so painful that you didn't want to do it.
Well, but it's worth noting that positive rewards are about 5 to 9 times more powerful than negative rewards.
Yeah.
So think about how most people go running. They wake up in the morning, they go for a run, they come home. Now they're running late, right? So they rush through their shower, and then they jump in the car and they take the kids to school, and then they get to their desk and they're kind of sweaty. They're effectively punishing themselves for exercising. And your brain pays attention to those rewards and those punishments. Now, you can definitely use negative rewards to try and change your behavior. The problem is they're very, very costly. You really have to have a massive negative reward, and a small positive reward will have just as much impact. Yeah. And the truth of the matter is, if you write a check to the American Nazi Association for $1,000, and then it automatically gets sent because you didn't work out that day, odds are you are not going to write that check again, right? Like habits work because they're stable, because they're repetitive, because they're iterative.
Right. I guess that's less of a sustainable. It may work for like a single time. Yeah. That's
it. Can definitely, and what it's really doing, frankly, is it's just drawing your attention to the behavior, right? I mean, if you really hated Nazis enough, you would run every single day.
Right.
So like, for instance, when we tell people, if you don't exercise today, I will shoot you, they exercise every single day.
Right.
But the negative reward is very costly.
No, that's a fair point. So I got to remember that on the what's the cue, what's the routine, what's the reward. The other big takeaway for me from that book, and I think a lot of other people, was the notion of a keystone habit. This one habit that sort of serves as the gateway to improve all other habits. And my son actually has to read his book is Make Your Bed for school. He's got to read it before school. Right. He's reading it now, which sort of focused on that. But we hear a lot about the keystone habit, like I think personally, whether it's exercise or make your bed or otherwise. I thought it was really interesting. And there's a lot of business leaders on here. Your sort of example of Alcoa and like how do people in the professional context think about what's the one thing that can start to change everything in your organization? That's a really powerful concept.
So just for folks who don't know the Alcoa story, when Paul O'Neill, who eventually became Treasury Secretary, when Paul O'Neill took over Alcoa, it was already a relatively safe company, but it was a company that basically was at war with itself, right? Like the unions and management, they actually would like have strikes, multi-state strikes, and they would dress up dummies like managers and throw them over light posts and set them on fire. Like it was a really bad environment. And so Paul O'Neill comes in and he says, okay, look, I'm going to tell you the number one thing that we're going to focus on: worker safety. We are going to be the safest company in America, which is kind of ridiculous. It's an aluminum manufacturer, right? They literally handle, 10,000 degree molten metal every single day. And they're like, we're going to be safer than an accounting office. But what happened is two things. Number one, it's a way of talking about our values, right? When we choose a keystone habit, we say, this habit is the most important thing. This is what we're going to focus on. We basically express a set of values to our organization.
Right.
But the second thing is that oftentimes, if we choose the right habit, a habit that changes how we see ourselves, changes our priorities, it sets off chain reactions in an industrial landscape that other things have to get better. So it turns out that, for instance, the safest way to make aluminum is to make it the right way every single time. And the only way to make it the right way every single time is to make sure that all the safety protocols are in place and that they are being observed every single time. Not just because violating the safety protocol makes workers unsafe, but also because it was diminishing the quality of the aluminum itself.
Yeah.
And so if Paul O'Neill had come in and said, we're going to make the best aluminum and we're going to make tons of money, the union would have been like, blow it out your ear, buddy. But when he comes in and he says, worker safety is the most important habit that we are going to focus on, then it gives you an ability to have a conversation about what ought to change, where everyone can buy in rather than fighting each other.
Is he still alive?
No, he passed away probably 2 or 3 years ago now.
I was going to say, I wonder if he's available for a consult to Boeing. It seems like, but in all seriousness, like, what would you recommend? Like Boeing, like they stranded astronauts this week. Like it just goes from worse to worse.
I know
every week. Like and just like what would
I did
you?
A little,
yeah.
I might write about it at some point, and so I've been doing a little bit of reporting. Like I think what happened was, again, this is the power of keystone habits. The number one focus became on making the schedule, like hitting the schedule, right? And so, like, if you could find a way to speed things up,
there's a lot of different industries that could probably do that would be better suited than aerospace, right?
Well, that's exactly it. And that's not a terrible thing, right? Because I, on the other hand, on the other side of that, like all these other companies depend on Boeing. If we're going to send shuttles up into space, then we need things delivered on time. But the question is, what's the topmost priority, right? Is safety and quality of our product more important than hitting the schedule? Or is the schedule more important than safety and quality? Right. And then secondarily, how do we signal that to the organization, right? Because if I say like, you should be safe and you should hit your schedules, everyone's going to be like, okay, what he's really saying is hit the schedules. But a good example is that, Paul O'Neill, again, going back to Alcoa, about a year after he stepped into the CEO role, there was this beloved executive who's a VP in Alcoa. He had been there for like 30 years. And there was a problem at one of the plants in Mexico where there was basically sort of a gas escape, like gas leak.
Yeah.
And some workers got sick and they were sent home. And the guy never told Paul O'Neill. He never reported it up the chain. And part of their safety protocols were you always report stuff like this up the chain. And so Paul O'Neill called him in and he said, hey, did this really happen? And the guy said, yeah, it happened. It wasn't a big deal. So I didn't report it up the chain. And Paul O'Neill said, okay, you're fired.
Yeah.
And it was front page news the next day in the Wall Street Journal. And the reason why Paul O'Neill fired that guy was to send a message.
Yeah.
Safety is the number one priority. If you violate that, no matter who you are, you will get fired. And that's what's really important for leaders when they think about keystone habits. Not just how do we choose the habit, how do we
really willing to enforce it?
And honestly, we all know that like there's the times that you send messages are when you hire, when you fire, or when you pay someone.
Yeah.
And if somebody sees someone get fired because they did a great job in all things, but they skimped on safety or they skimped on product quality, then it sends a message, this is actually number one.
Yeah, look, this is where I think a lot of college leaders have lost their campuses, and because no one's been fired, right? And so everyone's like, let's test like those boundaries and those rules because we don't really see any consequences to it. And we're going to see soon whether anyone's learned anything from a leadership standpoint headed into this fall from last year.
Well, I think they definitely have. And I will also say, like, I think that being a university president is a really hard job. Like in many ways, it's a lot easier to be the CEO of a big company like Boeing.
Maybe not right now. That's a real Sophie's choice. Do you want to be the
that's true.
CEO?
But one of the things that happens on a university campus because of this shared governance model, right?
Yeah.
So the CEO of a university actually doesn't have the power to fire.
Yeah, we're starting to learn. Like, I think no one totally understands, and it's different at these schools who actually has authority.
Yeah. And so also when you think about it, like you have all these students. So if a student acts like a numbskull, but not a dangerous numbskull, like, and your job is to teach that student, should you kick that student out? Or should you say like, look, our job is to convince you that this was a stupid thing to do and you shouldn't do it again.
Yeah. The problem is when you have a rule and you say it's the rule and you tell people there's gonna be a consequence and then they break the rule and then you withhold the consequence. Any of us who have led people or had parents know what sort of comes next. And I'm not saying you have to be draconian, but if you look at someone like Florida, like they just highlighted if you actually break the rules, the consequences will be real. And a lot of these other schools, the student body just overrules the leader trying to enforce the rule. And so it's a really hard way to lead.
It's a difficult, yeah. And the goal there is not to sort of maximize profit or to maximize output. The goal is this more amorphous educational goal.
Yeah, it is complicated, but that's a good question. I should put that as a poll on LinkedIn. Would you rather be the leader of Columbia or Boeing right now? Like, what is the least desirable job in America? But look, in any of these jobs, you need to be a good communicator. Your latest book, Supercommunicators, you talked a little bit about the genesis of that. Similar. What are some of the traits that you found of supercommunicators? And also, is it learned or is it how much of this is innate versus learned?
It's 100% learned. Like, this is the thing. Nobody is born a great communicator, or nobody is born any better a communicator than anyone else. Every single time we meet someone who's just fantastic at communication, it is not because they were born with a gift of gab. It is because they learned certain skills, and anyone can learn those skills. They're totally transferable.
Anyone can learn the skills, but I'll push you on that. Like, there's people who are naturally extroverted and like talking, and there's people that don't. I'm not saying that they couldn't learn it, but like, it's just not.
So the science basically does not agree with you. Like, what the science says,
I'll have to disagree with the science. I know I'll be shunned on that. To me, it's like, look, you can teach me to swing a baseball like all day long, and I will never have the hand-eye coordination of some other people. So
no, that's absolutely true. When it comes to physical activities, like there's definitely things about like your muscle makeup and fast twitch versus slow twitch. But Well, let me ask you. Do you consider yourself someone who's good with people? Like, do you? If you're at a party, are you the person awkwardly in the corner, or can you make conversation?
I'm an extroverted introvert. So I'm very good conversationally with people I know and like to do that. I have no interest in walking into a room with a bunch of people I don't know and like starting up random conversations. So I could, but I don't really. It's just I don't have an interest in it.
So I think you are proving the thesis that I'm offering, which is being an extroverted introvert is not actually a thing. That's like saying like I'm a pregnant, unpregnant person. Like the fact that you perhaps your natural disposition is that you would prefer to sort of just read and be on your own, but you've taught yourself how to be really good at dealing with people. And It might be actually true also that your natural disposition is not that you like to be alone. It's just that you don't want to be in like a party where you don't know anyone and tired.
Well, we get a digression, but there's an energy thing there. I think what I've seen with people who tend to be, is an energy thing where it's like what gives you energy and what takes away energy, and like in terms of recovering. So
when it comes to communication, though,
it's all learned.
It's all learned skills, and it's worth defining what a super communicator is. And there's a simple way to do this. I'll ask you a question. If you were having a really bad day and you came home and you wanted to call someone who you know would make you feel better, do you know who you would call?
Yeah, there's probably a couple.
Who is that?
Yeah,
who's one of them?
I'd call my wife. Yeah.
Okay. And why? Your wife is a super communicator for you, and you're probably a super communicator back for her. But what does your wife do when you call her that makes you feel better?
She would listen, and she's very empathetic.
Okay. And my guess is that those skills, listening, showing empathy, are those skills that she uses with other people as well?
Yes.
And are those skills that you've ever tried to imitate, that you've sort of looked at her and said like,
sure, I'm not as good at them. Like,
yeah,
yes.
You're not as practiced, right? It's not as much of a priority for you. So we are all super communicators at various times in our life, right? We all have had those moments when a friend calls and we know exactly what to say, or we walk into a meeting and we know exactly how to win over everyone to our point of view. There are some people who are consistent super communicators who can do this with almost anyone. They can connect with almost anyone. And it's not because they are born that way.
They were in debate club with you. That's why.
They might have been, right. They definitely weren't in debate club with me. Like, that's how you learn to like become a jerk as you grow up. But what is interesting is if you talk to consistent super communicators, what they'll often say is, and ask them, were you always good at communication? They'll often say no. They'll say like, I wasn't very popular in high school, so I had to study how kids talk to each other and really make friends. Or my parents got divorced and I had to be the peacemaker between them.
I've had a bunch of people on this podcast who are in fields around getting to know people and whatever. And they were army brats, right? And they went to a new school every year. And so it was a survival mechanism of like, they had to figure out how to integrate, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a skill that you learn under pressure. And so what's interesting is that your wife probably does not think about her listening and her empathy as a set of skills, but they are. And if she recognizes them as skills, it can occur to her to say like, oh, I can use these skills with anyone, right? I use it with my husband and I use it with my kids, but I could also use it with a stranger on the bus. Right. I could also use it with like the person on the consumer, when I call in to complain about my credit card. Super communicators simply have recognized that there's a set of skills that help us connect with other people, and they see those as skills, and therefore they make them more fungible. And one of the biggest ones is what you mentioned. They ask a lot of questions. Consistent super communicators ask 10 to 20 times as many questions as the average person. Huh. And they tend to ask a high number of deep questions, which are questions about your values or your beliefs or your experiences, which can sound kind of intimidating as like just a casual question. But it's as simple as if you meet someone who's a doctor, instead of asking them,
they want to understand at a deep level.
Yeah. Well, instead of asking, what hospital do you work at? Asking, oh, what made you decide to go to medical school?
Yeah.
Or what do you like about being a doctor? Right? Those are questions that really invite us to talk about who we are.
But in terms of being a communicator, that sounds like it helps them be a good receiver. But are you saying that they need to receive that in order then to communicate and deliver the message that they think is effective?
Well, I mean, in general, let me ask you, when you go into a meeting and you don't ask any questions and you just tell people what you think and they never speak,
Yeah, they
Would you
love
say
it.
That's
No, I mean, the best salespeople, if you ever had an extraordinary sales leader, they all just ask questions. Like
they
when
just ask
go
questions
into-
incessantly,
yeah,
right?
Yeah,
And it's not just because they're trying to learn about you, which they are.
Yeah.
It's because of some other stuff, some other skills that supercommunicators have. When you respond to those questions, they prove that they are listening to you, right? They prove they are paying attention. They often repeat back what you said. They ask if they got it right. They try and build on it, show that they're processing it. There's actually a technique for this known as looping for understanding. And what's important there is if I believe you are listening to me, I become much more likely to listen to you in return. I actually can't help but become more likely to listen to you in return. It's hardwired into our brains. So asking questions, you're right. Asking questions is about getting the other person to speak, but it's also about setting yourself up to speak. Because this is the other thing about deep questions. It's very natural with a deep question to answer our own question. Oh, you became a doctor because you saw your dad get sick. That's so interesting. I'm a lawyer, and it happened because I saw my uncle get arrested when I was a kid. Right? Now we're actually communicating with each other. And because I'm proving that I listen to you, you're listening back to me.
So you talk about three types of conversations: practical, emotional, and social.
Yeah.
What is similar or different about success in those three conversations?
So the reason why this is important is because this is one of the big findings of neuroscientists is that we tend to assume that discussions are about one thing, like we're talking about my book, or we're talking about where to go on vacation, or our kids' grades. But actually, every discussion is made up of multiple kinds of conversations.
Yeah.
And those conversations tend to fall into one of those three buckets: the practical, the emotional, and the social. And a practical conversation is when, for instance, we're trying to make plans together, or we're trying to solve a problem together. And we're using the prefrontal cortex. And the whole goal of communication is to become what's known as neurally entrained, for our brains to begin looking alike. That's when we feel connected to each other.
Okay.
So if we're both talking about practical stuff, then we're using the prefrontal cortex. We can achieve that entrainment.
But I can already see where men and women run into trouble with this, but keep going.
So let's say I come and I'm having an emotional conversation. I'm telling you how I feel.
And I want to solve your problems. Yeah.
And you want to solve my feelings.
This has never happened before for me.
Yeah,
other
never,
people
never.
Here. Yeah.
I'm sure. Right. That's exactly. So I'm using the amygdala, the deep interior of my brain. You're using the prefrontal cortex. There's very little chance we're going to become entrained, right?
Yeah.
And in fact, this is known as the matching principle. And what the matching principle says is communication requires people to be having the same kind of conversation at the same moment. Now, that doesn't mean we have to stay in that conversation, right?
Right.
Once we get aligned on an emotional conversation, we can move to the practical together. We can move to the social together. We can move back to emotional together.
Right. And people that are better partners than me, I've heard a tactic that you probably thought where when they, you come to me with that or whatever, people have more patience than I do, would say, Charles, like, are you looking for me to listen here? Are you looking for advice? They actually try to even set that context.
My wife and I do that all the time.
Yeah.
In fact, they teach teachers in schools to do this, that if a student comes up, they should ask them, do you want to be helped? Do you want to be hugged? Or do you want to be heard?
It occurs to me as you say that in this context now, why that's such a powerful tactic.
Yeah. And it's the three kinds of conversations, right? The practical, the emotional, and the social. And the thing is that I don't have to match you. I can invite you to match me.
Right.
But if we're not having the same kind of conversation at the same moment, then your wife's going to get frustrated because you're trying to solve her emotions, and you're going to get frustrated because you can't figure out why she keeps complaining when there's an obvious solution there.
Yes. Never happened before, but I can understand. Well, let me ask you, like in today's world too, like to me, there's a good and a bad, right? There's becoming a super communicator to make great connections or otherwise. But then we also have these super communicators who are probably learning these skills to stoke fear and division, and they're really good at it too.
Yeah. I think the thing about communication is that communication is a tool. And so like an axe is a tool, right? And you can use an axe to build a house or to chop someone's head off. It has much more to do with who's wielding the tool. But the thing that is important there is that,
are the tactics the same? Are they good at those? Are the super communicators are they very good at? I guess they tap into emotional.
I mean, honestly, if anyone listening who hasn't been to a Trump rally and a Harris rally should go. And what you will see is that when they're on that stage, and we don't think of this as being like a conversation, right? When they're on that stage, the speaker is proving to the audience that they're listening to them. They, like, when people start applauding, they're leaning into it. They're saying more on that topic. Like, people who are super communicators, it's the same tactics and the same tools. Now, the truth of the matter is, though, that like it's not as easy to manipulate people as we think it is. So there's been all these studies, for instance, of scams, right? Like who gets caught up in Nigerian prince scams and stuff like that. and inevitably what they find is that the person who got duped, they knew that it was a scam, but there was some reward there that was enough to basically cause them to ignore knowing that, right?
So it wasn't that they didn't have doubt.
Nobody thinks that a Nigerian prince is going to send them $1 million, but they love that someone calls them all the time, and it feels exciting and it feels fun to think about. Like literally, none of us have ever met someone who just randomly got $1 million from a prince, right?
Right.
But there's something there. It's very hard to actually dupe other people, particularly without some.
So they're good at building connection.
Yeah, when these demagogues or when these leaders use these tactics, it's not that they're tricking us. They're not pretending that they're something that they aren't. They're telling us what they believe and what we want to be true, whether that be that, the world can become a more just place, or that, Americans are being pushed out of their jobs by immigrants. Like, it's not like they're duping us into believing a world that already exists. They're reinforcing a world that we already believe in.
Right. Yeah. I was going to ask you, like, I'm trying to understand like what Elon Musk's strategy is these days around communication. That might be a whole separate episode, but yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I actually wrote a story about Musk and Tesla a number of years ago. I don't know. I mean, I don't think his goal is to be a super communicator with people who don't already agree with him. Right. I think he's very comfortable talking to people who are predisposed to agree with him and egging them on. And, lots of people do that. It's just that
he bought a very expensive microphone to do that.
Microphone.
Yeah. So what are other misconceptions about good communicators, or mistakes that people make where they think that this is really going to help me communicate well and it does not?
So there's a couple skills we talked about: asking more questions, particularly deep questions, proving that you're listening, right? This activity known as looping for understanding, where you ask a question, you repeat back what you heard in your own words, show you're really thinking about it, ask if you got it right. I think the other thing that happens is that people get confused about what the goal of a conversation is. And they think the goal of this conversation is to impress you, right? The goal of this conversation is to convince you that I'm right and you're wrong, or that I'm smart.
Which has never happened, by the way. It's amazing to me that people still do this. I've always said, in a relationship, how many of the fights that you have had in your relationship where at some point your partner said, you know what, actually, I was totally wrong and I now agree with everything you said? Like, it's literally never happened.
No, it never happened. And it's totally natural that it shouldn't happen, right? Yeah. And so then it raises this question. Okay, if the goal is not to basically convince the other person that they're wrong, what is the goal of a conversation? The goal of a conversation is for me to understand how you see the world and to speak in such a way that you can understand me.
Right.
Like, if we walk away totally disagreeing with each other, thinking that the other person is an idiot, but if I understand you and you understand me, we will feel connected on some level. And that connection is enough for us to forge a relationship. So people make a mistake that they go into a conversation and they think, I really want to convince this person. I'm going to say something so clever. I want to convince them about how smart I am, or I want to convince them that I have the best idea. But actually, if you go into a conversation
to do that,
if you go into a conversation saying, my whole goal is to make a connection with this person. Like, I'm going to listen to them and I'm going to prove to them that I'm listening. And when I bring up my ideas, it's going to be kind of stuff that they can relate to a little bit. That is going to be much, much more successful than saying, I'm going to go in and I'm going to win this conversation.
There's a formula that one of my previous guest, Malik, had shared. He said he worked on a lot of change with youth, and the formula was connection plus challenge equals change. And I always really like that. And so sometimes when you go into these things, you actually, through some challenge, you develop some connection that you need. But a lot of times without the connection, you don't have the right to challenge.
That's exactly right. And I think what's important there is that it recognizes that a relationship is not about agreeing with each other. A relationship is about being able to discuss where you see things differently, right? Like, if you think about, what are the moments that we're most proud of in American history? They are inevitably times when people who disagreed with each other just had a conversation and came together. The Constitutional Convention was a couple dozen people who literally hated each other's guts getting together for months at a time, screaming at each other, and then coming up with a constitution.
Yeah.
Like communication is Homo sapiens' superpower.
Yeah.
It is the thing that makes us so successful. And so we're all good at it. Our brains have evolved to be great at communication. We just have to understand the skills that allow that instinctual greatness to come out.
And I've heard a lot of these things. What differs with online versus in person with a lot of this stuff?
So it's kind of a changing thing. So a good example of this is about 100 years ago when phones first became popular. There was a lot of studies that appeared that said no one will ever have a real conversation on the telephone. Because up till that point, basically all conversations had happened face to face, right? The concept that you could do it.
Now you just want to get people on the phone.
Yeah, exactly. And what's interesting is at the time they were right. Like for the first 15 years of phone usage, people used them like telegrams. They would call up, they would give a stock order or a grocery order, and then they'd hang up. Now, by the time we were in middle school, of course, we could like talk on the phone for 7 hours a night, right?
Yeah.
And it's because we learned how to use phones. And even today, without realizing it, if you're on the phone, you will over enunciate your words by about a third. You'll put about 20% more emotion into your voice.
Interesting.
Because you know that the person can't see you. You're not doing it consciously. You're doing it unconsciously, but you know the rules of phone conversation. We are learning the rules for online communication right now. Our kids are learning them much faster than we are because they're much more practiced.
Right.
And they have less habits from the past.
So we have not perfected the art form yet.
I have not. Maybe you have.
No. Angry typing and yelling at people on Twitter is probably not our highest form of online communication.
Probably.
Right. And that, I think, I mean, that is the problem, right? It sounds like these things, good communication needs to be conversational and synchronous. And a lot of this is yelling and asynchronous.
That's exactly. Well, and good conversation is an exchange, right? It's a back and forth. It's where I say something and I believe you are listening to me, and you say something and you believe I'm listening, rather than we're just waiting our turns to speak. And in that back and forth, what's known as an exchange of vulnerabilities or an exchange of authenticity or authentic reciprocity, that is what actually makes us feel connected to other people.
Interesting. Well, we've all got a lot to work on for sure. I know we could keep going, but I know we got to wrap up here. So Charles, where can people learn more about you and your work and your writing and
Absolutely.
your books?
If you Google me, Charles Duhigg, my website will come up. My books, Power of Habit and Supercommunicators, can be bought anywhere you buy books, on Amazon or Audible or your local bookseller, which is a great place to buy them. I'm on Twitter at @CDuhigg. Luckily, there are no other Charles Duhiggs in the world. So if you Google me, you will definitely find me.
All right, Charles. Well, thanks for joining us today. Hope we get a chance to do this again. I'm sure there's a whole bunch more we could talk about. So thank you.
Thanks for having me.